For years, Evelyn Carter let local riders use the old trail crossing one corner of her farm. Then Preston Hale bought the neighboring ridge, and a few familiar horses suddenly became 40 every morning. Evelyn discovered that Preston had advertised her private trail as an amenity for his luxury equestrian development. He built 14 expensive properties and promised buyers direct access across land he had never owned. When Evelyn objected, Preston insisted the route was permanent because riders had used it for decades. Evelyn didn't argue. She checked her deed, hired a surveyor, called an attorney, and documented every group. Then she closed the trail, exposing that Preston had advertised permanent access without ever securing an easement. Before we continue, tell us in the comments whether years of neighborly permission should ever allow a developer to advertise someone else's land as a permanent amenity. Evelyn Carter heard the horses before she saw them. She was carrying a bucket toward the barn when the steady rhythm of hooves rolled across the lower pasture. At first, she assumed it was one of the local riders. For years, Evelyn had occasionally allowed neighbors to use the old trail crossing a corner of her farm. Usually, one or two horses passed through. They asked first, closed the gate behind them, and were gone within minutes. But this didn't sound like two horses. Evelyn set down the bucket and walked toward the trail. 5 riders appeared around the bend. Then another group followed, and then another. She began counting. 12, 21, 34. By the time the last horse passed the barn, Evelyn had counted 40. A man riding at the front lifted one hand, mourning. Evelyn stared at the long procession behind him. Where are all of you coming from? Ridgeview Estates. She knew the name. Developer Preston Hale had purchased the neighboring ridge 2 years earlier and transformed it into an expensive equestrian development. 14 luxury homes, private stables, paddocks, and large lots designed for owners who wanted horses outside their back doors. But Evelyn quickly realized the 40 horses didn't belong to 40 homeowners. Some riders were Ridgeview residents. Others were their guests. Several horses came from the development's shared boarding and training operation, while guided rides also included prospective buyers being shown the equestrian lifestyle Preston was selling. That explained the number. It didn't explain why any of them were on Evelyn's land. Who told you to use this trail? She asked. The guide looked confused. It's the Ridgeview riding route. According to whom? Mr. Hale's development. Before Evelyn could ask another question, the group continued toward the ridge. She watched until the final horse disappeared. Later that morning, Evelyn inspected the trail. Fresh hoofprints covered the ground. The narrow path crossed a section of her farm before reaching the neighboring property. Her father had once used part of it to move equipment between fields. Over the years, local riders had occasionally asked permission to pass through. Evelyn usually said yes. But this wasn't a neighbor taking a Saturday ride. It was organized, scheduled, and, judging by the guide and prospective buyers, at least partly commercial. At 8:10 the next morning, Evelyn was waiting. 38 horses passed. The exact count varied slightly with the residents, guests, shared boarding horses, and prospective buyers scheduled that day, but the organized procession consistently remained close to 40. From then on, 40 became Evelyn's shorthand for the daily Ridgeview group, not a claim that the same fixed herd crossed every morning. Residents, guests, a few riders Evelyn recognized from the previous day, and another guide leading people she had never seen before. The following morning, there were 40 again. Evelyn stopped the guide. Is this happening every day? Most mornings. How long? A few weeks. And who gave Ridgeview permission to cross my farm? The man's confidence disappeared. We were told the development had trail access. Who told you that? Mr. Hale. That afternoon, Evelyn called Preston. I need your riding groups off my farm. There was a pause. Then Preston laughed softly. Evelyn, they're using the old trail. People use that trail because I allowed them to. People have ridden it for years. A few neighbors have, not organized groups from 14 luxury properties. Preston's voice hardened. That trail is part of the access people expect up here. Evelyn looked through her kitchen window toward the hoofprints. Then you should have talked to me before you promised it. The next morning, at almost exactly 8, she heard the hoofbeats again. 40 horses were crossing her farm as though Preston's promise mattered more than her permission. Evelyn didn't stop the riders the next morning. She wanted to understand exactly what Preston had turned her old farm trail into. so she stood near the barn and watched. The first group appeared shortly after 8. A guide rode in front. Behind him came couples on polished horses, several younger riders, and people Evelyn had never seen before. This wasn't 40 neighbors independently choosing the same trail. It was organized. The riders stayed together, followed the same route, and continued toward Ridgeview Estates, as though Evelyn's farm were simply one section of a much larger riding network. One woman slowed near Evelyn. "Beautiful property." "Thank you. Is this part of Ridgeview?" Evelyn looked at her. "No." The woman seemed surprised. "Oh, I thought the trail belonged to the development." "It doesn't." The rider glanced toward the guide before continuing. That answer told Evelyn more than she expected. Later that morning, Preston's truck appeared near the western boundary. Evelyn walked over before he could leave. "We spoke yesterday." "We did. And 40 horses crossed my farm again this morning. They're using the existing trail." "You keep saying that like the trail owns itself." Preston sighed. "Evelyn, people have ridden through here for years. A few neighbors have, exactly. Because they asked." Preston leaned against his truck. "It's an established route." "Established for what?" "Riding." "That's not what I asked." His expression tightened. Evelyn continued. "I let Jim Harper cross sometimes. The Morrison girls used to call before riding through. A few other people asked over the years." "That's not the same as 40 people from your development coming through every morning." Preston shook his head. "You're making a distinction nobody cared about until now." "I care about it." Then Preston said something that changed the conversation. "My buyers were told they'd have direct trail access." Evelyn stared at him. "Across whose land?" "The route connects through here." "That wasn't my question." Preston didn't answer. Evelyn stepped closer. "Did you tell your buyers they could ride across my farm?" "They were told the community connects to the trail system." "Through my farm?" "It's the route that's always been used." Evelyn felt her irritation sharpen. Preston wasn't talking about permission. He was talking as though years of neighborly courtesy had somehow become an amenity attached to his 14 expensive properties. "I never gave your development permission." "You never objected to riders before." "They asked." "Not every single time." "Because I knew who they were." Preston spread his hands. "So, what's the difference?" Evelyn looked toward the hoofprints covering the trail. 40 horses a day is the difference." Preston climbed back into his truck. "I wouldn't make this into a bigger problem than it needs to be. I'm not the one who brought 40 horses onto somebody else's farm." He closed the door. "The trail was here before Ridgeview, and my farm was here before Ridgeview." Preston drove away. That afternoon, Evelyn began calling the local riders who had crossed her property over the years. Their answers were remarkably similar. Yes, they remembered asking. Yes, Evelyn or her family had allowed them through. No, none of them remembered being told the trail was public. By evening, Evelyn understood what Preston had done. He had taken an informal favor between neighbors and treated it like a permanent route for his development. But she still didn't know how far he'd gone. The answer arrived the following morning when one of Ridgeview's prospective buyers stopped beside her barn and unfolded a glossy brochure. A colored map covered the inside page. The development sat on the ridge. A bold riding route descended from it, crossed directly through Evelyn's farm, and continued toward the countryside beyond. Above the map were 3 words: private riding access. Evelyn took the brochure carefully. "Where did you get this?" The prospective buyer pointed toward Ridgeview Estates. "At the sales office." Evelyn unfolded it completely. The map showed 14 home sites arranged along the ridge, each with space for private stables and paddocks. A green line left the development, descended toward Evelyn's property, crossed the old farm trail, then continued toward miles of open countryside. Beside it were the words, "private riding access." Farther down, another line promised, "ride directly from your property into an established countryside trail network." Evelyn read it twice. "Did they tell you this route was part of what you're buying?" The woman nodded. "That's one of the reasons we're interested." Evelyn looked up. "Did anyone tell you part of it crosses privately owned farmland?" The woman's smile disappeared. "No." Evelyn handed the brochure back. "Keep that." "Is there a problem?" There might be. The woman looked toward Ridgeview. Our agent said residents could ride straight out without trailering the horses anywhere. Evelyn chose her words carefully. I can't tell you what rights come with those properties. But nobody has asked me for permanent riding access across this farm. The buyer stared at the map again. The green line suddenly looked very different. So they don't have permission. Not from me. That afternoon, Evelyn drove to Ridgeview. She had seen the development from below for months, but she'd never entered the sales area. Everything about it had been designed to sell a lifestyle. Stone entrance pillars, fresh fencing, wide lots, elegant barns positioned beside enormous homes. Near the sales office stood a large display board, Ridgeview Equestrian Estates. Below it, live where the trail begins. Evelyn stopped walking. There was the same map, and there was her trail. A sales representative approached. Can I help you? Evelyn pointed at the green route. Where does this trail go? The representative smiled. It connects our residents directly to the countryside riding network. Through that farm? Yes. Who owns the farm? The representative hesitated. I'm not sure. I do. The smile vanished. Minutes later, Preston appeared from the office. Evelyn, you put my property in your brochure. It's a trail map. You advertised access across my farm. We advertise access to the trail system. Your map draws the route through my land. Preston lowered his voice. Can we discuss this inside? No. Several people near the sales office were already looking toward them. Evelyn held up the brochure. Did you secure an easement before you printed this? Preston's jaw tightened. The trail has existed for decades. That's not what I asked. Our legal team reviewed the project. Then show me the document that gives your development the right to send riders across my farm. Preston said nothing for several seconds. Then he answered, I'll have someone pull the records. Evelyn returned home with one question becoming more important than the 40 horses themselves. How many people had already been sold this promise? She found part of the answer 2 days later. The prospective buyer called her. We decided not to sign anything until they clarify the trail. Then she added something Evelyn hadn't expected. Some of the homes are already sold. How many? I don't know. But I spoke to 2 owners. They both said direct riding access was part of the appeal. After the call, Evelyn looked toward Ridgeview. This was no longer just about riders using an old path. Preston had attached commercial value to it. Somewhere between designing 14 luxury horse properties and selling the lifestyle around them, he'd apparently made one dangerous assumption, that a trail crossing Evelyn's farm was his to promise simply because she'd once been kind enough to let neighbors use it. Preston came to Evelyn's farm the following afternoon. This time, he didn't arrive alone. A man in a gray jacket stepped out of the passenger side carrying a leather folder. Preston introduced him as someone who handled property matters for Ridgeview Estates. Evelyn noticed he didn't call him an attorney. They met beside the old trail. 40 sets of hoofprints were still pressed into the dirt. Preston looked at them. We need to settle this before it becomes unnecessary drama. Evelyn folded her arms. Good. Stop sending riders across my property. It's not that simple. It was simple before you started advertising it. The man beside Preston opened his folder. Our understanding is that this trail has been used for horseback access for many years. It has. Preston looked almost satisfied. Then Evelyn added, by people I allowed to use it. The man's expression changed slightly. You personally gave riders permission? Many times. Verbally? Usually. Any written records? Some. Preston interrupted. Come on, Evelyn. People have been crossing here forever. A few neighbors riding through occasionally isn't 40 horses from your development every morning. The route already existed. So did my barn. That doesn't make it yours. Preston exhaled. We sold these properties around an equestrian lifestyle. That's your business. Direct trail access is part of that. Then you should have secured direct trail access before you sold it. Preston stepped onto the trail. You can't suddenly close something people have used for years. Evelyn looked at him. There it was. It was not a request or an apology, but a claim. Why not? Because long-standing access matters. Maybe it does. Preston seemed surprised by her answer. Evelyn continued. But I'm not going to stand here pretending I know exactly what legal rights years of occasional use may or may not create. She pointed toward his folder. So, show me yours. My what? The easement. Silence. The recorded agreement, right-of-way, or whatever document gives Ridgeview Estates the permanent right to send residents, employees, guests, and sales tours through my farm. The man beside Preston looked down at his folder. Preston didn't. Our legal people reviewed the development. That's not a document. We'll pull the records. Good. Evelyn had already made one decision. Until she understood exactly what rights existed, she wasn't going to rip up the trail, block riders with machinery, or start a confrontation that might create a bigger problem. But she wasn't going to accept Preston's interpretation either. That evening, she gathered everything she had. Her deed, old property papers, tax maps, and a folder containing notes her father had kept about the farm. She also searched old messages on her phone. There were more than she remembered. Mind if we ride through Saturday? Could we use the lower trail tomorrow morning? Thanks for letting us cross again. Short conversations. Ordinary neighborly exchanges. But now they seemed important. The next morning, the horses came again. Evelyn stood beside the trail as they passed. This time, she didn't argue with the guide. She photographed the group from her own property and wrote down the time. 8:06 a.m. 39 horses. The following morning, 8:11 a.m., 40 horses. Preston was no longer merely benefiting from occasional historical use. He was continuing to route organized groups across Evelyn's farm after she'd explicitly objected. So Evelyn made two appointments. One with a licensed surveyor, and the other with a property attorney who could review the title history. She wasn't interested in winning an argument beside a dirt trail. She wanted to know exactly where the trail sat, what had been recorded against her land, and whether Preston's confidence existed anywhere outside his sales brochure. 3 days later, the surveyor called first. He had located the old trail, and his opening sentence made Evelyn sit upright. The section we're discussing is inside your parcel. The surveyor, Daniel Ross, met Evelyn beside the western pasture 2 mornings later. He carried a field tablet and copies of the recorded survey documents he'd reviewed. Evelyn walked with him toward the old trail. How certain are you? Daniel pointed toward the markers he'd located. About where the trail physically sits, very. This section runs inside your parcel. All of it? The portion Preston's riders are using to cross your farm does. Evelyn looked toward Ridgeview Estates. That answered one question. But Daniel immediately warned her not to confuse a property boundary with an access right. Owning the ground doesn't automatically end the investigation. Evelyn nodded. Because of an easement? Exactly. Someone can have a legal right to cross land they don't own. That's why you need the title records reviewed. That was what Evelyn intended to do next. That afternoon, she met property attorney Rachel Monroe. Evelyn brought her deed, Daniel's survey information, the Ridgeview brochure, and several old messages from local riders. Rachel began with the recorded documents. She traced the parcel history and reviewed easements referenced in the title records. There were utility rights, an old drainage provision, and other restrictions that had nothing to do with horses. But nothing Rachel reviewed gave Ridgeview Estates an obvious recorded riding easement across the trail Preston had advertised. Evelyn leaned forward. So he has nothing. Rachel shook her head. Don't jump that far yet. Evelyn sat back. Why? Because the absence of a recorded easement is important. But Preston may still try to argue that historical use created some other access right. Whether such a claim could succeed depends on facts we haven't established. Like what? Who used the trail, for how long, how openly, under what circumstances, and most importantly for what you're telling me, whether that use was with permission. That word changed everything. Permission. Evelyn opened the folder she'd brought. My family never treated this as a public trail. She showed Rachel several messages. Could we ride through Saturday? Another read. Thanks for letting us use the lower trail. And another. Is it okay if we cross after lunch? Rachel read them carefully. Keep the originals. I have years of these. Good. Don't delete anything. Evelyn explained that some riders had stopped asking every single time after years of knowing her, but the arrangement had always been neighborly. There were no fees, no public trail signs, no agreement with a subdivision, and certainly no promise that dozens of strangers could cross every morning. Rachel made notes. Then we document the history before doing anything else. Over the next several days, Evelyn contacted people who had ridden the trail long before Ridgeview existed. Jim Harper remembered asking Evelyn's father. The Morrison sisters remembered calling Evelyn before bringing friends. Another longtime rider remembered being told to avoid the trail during certain farm operations. That detail mattered to Evelyn. If riders believed they possessed an unconditional right to cross, why had they waited when her family told them the trail wasn't available? Rachel remained cautious. None of those memories alone guaranteed the outcome of a legal dispute. But they contradicted Preston's simple story that the trail had always functioned as unrestricted access anyone could inherit and commercialize. Then Preston sent Evelyn an email. His position hadn't changed. He claimed the trail's long-standing use supported continued access and warned her not to interfere with Ridgeview residents while the matter was being reviewed. Evelyn forwarded it to Rachel. A few minutes later, Rachel called. "Don't argue with him. I wasn't planning to. And don't block anything yet. Why? Because now we know what his argument is. Before we respond, I want the historical use evidence organized." Evelyn looked toward the trail. Another group of horses was crossing. Preston was betting that decades of riders would prove the route belonged in his development's future. But Evelyn was beginning to uncover the detail he'd overlooked. Those riders hadn't crossed because nobody could stop them. They had crossed because Evelyn and her family had kept saying yes. Evelyn spent the next 3 days rebuilding the history of the trail, not from maps, but from people. Jim Harper came by first. He had ridden across the Carter farm for more than 20 years and remembered Evelyn's father clearly. "Your dad always let us through," Jim said. "Did he ever tell you the trail was public?" Jim laughed. "No. It was his farm." "Did you ask permission?" "At first, every time." "And later?" "Once he knew us, he'd usually say we didn't need to call unless we were bringing a group." Evelyn wrote that down. "What happened if he needed the trail closed?" "We stayed off it." That answer mattered. The Morrison sisters remembered something similar. Years earlier, they'd regularly ridden 2 horses through the lower pasture. Sometimes Evelyn allowed them through. Sometimes she asked them to wait because cattle were being moved or equipment was working near the trail. They waited. There were no arguments, no threats about access rights, and no one claimed Evelyn couldn't close the route. Another rider still had an old text from Evelyn: "You can cross tomorrow after 3. Please close the gate behind you." Rachel reviewed everything. "This doesn't automatically decide every possible legal claim," she cautioned, "but it gives us a much clearer history. The trail was used because we allowed it. That's what the evidence is supporting." And Preston never asked. "No." Evelyn looked toward Ridgeview. "He just assumed." Then Rachel found another useful detail. The previous owner of the ridge had occasionally ridden through Evelyn's farm too. Evelyn remembered him well. Thomas Bell. She called him. "Thomas, when you owned the ridge, how did you use our lower trail?" There was a pause. "With your permission." "Did you believe the ridge came with a permanent right across my farm?" "No." "Did you ever tell Preston it did?" "Absolutely not." Thomas explained that when he sold the ridge, he had transferred his property, not Evelyn's permission. He had never represented the trail as a deeded access right. After the call, Evelyn sat quietly. That distinction was almost painfully simple. Preston had bought Thomas's land. He had not bought every favor Thomas had once received from his neighbors. But Preston kept sending riders. The following morning, 36 horses crossed. The morning after that, 41. The changing number matched the explanation Evelyn had already documented. This was not one fixed herd, but a rotating group of residents, guests, boarding clients, guides, and prospective buyers that usually totaled around 40. Now Evelyn noticed something else. Some riders weren't homeowners. One couple stopped near her barn and asked how much farther the Ridgeview private trail experience continued. "Are you residents?" Evelyn asked. "Not yet," the man said. "We're touring the development." A Ridgeview guide called them forward before Evelyn could say more. She watched the group disappear down the trail. That changed the scale of the problem again. Preston wasn't merely allowing existing residents to use her farm. He was demonstrating the route to prospective buyers. Her property had become part of his sales presentation. Rachel prepared a formal written notice. It stated that Evelyn did not consent to Ridgeview Estates, its residents, employees, agents, guests, or prospective buyers using the farm trail as development access. It also made clear that any previous neighborly permission should not be treated as permission for organized or commercial use by Ridgeview. Evelyn sent it by a documented delivery method and kept a copy. Preston responded the next afternoon. He maintained that Ridgeview had a legitimate claim to continued trail access and that the matter was under review. But he still produced no recorded easement, and the riders kept coming. The following morning, Evelyn was moving a tractor attachment near the barn when a guided group rounded the bend. Several horses slowed abruptly. The guide raised his hand. Evelyn stopped the tractor. Nobody was hurt. Nothing collided. But for several tense seconds, farm equipment and a large riding group occupied a space Preston had been advertising as though it existed solely for recreation. Evelyn watched the last horse pass. That was enough. The old arrangement had depended on courtesy, communication, and permission. Preston had removed all three. He hadn't inherited a right to use Evelyn's farm. He had inherited a neighbor who was finally ready to stop saying yes. The near encounter with the tractor changed Evelyn's approach. For years, the old trail had worked because everyone understood what it was: permission. If Evelyn was moving equipment, riders waited. If livestock occupied the pasture, they came another day. If someone wanted to bring a larger group, they asked first. Preston had replaced that arrangement with scheduled traffic from a development Evelyn had never agreed to serve. After the formal notice, the horses were still coming. The next morning, Evelyn stood beside the barn with a notebook. At 8:04, the first group appeared. 39 horses. Some carried Ridgeview residents. Others carried guests and prospective buyers. 2 guides rode at the front and rear. Evelyn wrote down the time. She didn't block them. She didn't argue. Rachel had been clear about that. Document first. Act only after they were certain where Evelyn's property began and what legal position they were taking. By now, the trail near the barn showed the effects of repeated traffic. The soil had been churned in several places. Fresh manure appeared near an equipment entrance. More importantly, Evelyn had started adjusting her own farm work around Ridgeview's morning riding groups. That was when the problem became impossible to dismiss as neighborly use. Her working farm had become infrastructure for Preston's business. That afternoon, Rachel called. "I've finished reviewing Daniel's survey, the recorded title material, the statements from the longtime riders, Thomas Bell's account, and Preston's response." Evelyn sat down. "What does that mean for the trail?" "It means we need to be precise." Rachel didn't tell Evelyn that a lawyer could magically declare Preston had no possible claim. She said the opposite. If Preston believes historical use created some legally enforceable right, he can assert that claim through the proper process. We can't prevent him from trying. But nothing we've reviewed establishes a recorded riding easement benefiting Ridgeview. And the evidence we have strongly supports your position that the earlier riding use occurred by permission. Evelyn looked toward the trail. "So I don't have to keep voluntarily letting his groups through while he decides whether to challenge me. That's my advice based on what we've reviewed." Rachel prepared a final written notice. It revoked any permission Preston might claim for Ridgeview-related use. Residents, employees, guests, prospective buyers, and guided riding groups. The notice also made one thing explicit. If Preston claimed an independent legal right to cross the Carter farm, he would need to establish that right, rather than continue treating disputed access as an unquestioned development amenity. Preston received the notice that afternoon. He called Evelyn within an hour. "You can't decide the legal issue yourself." "I'm not." "Then don't close the trail. If you believe Ridgeview has a right to cross, have your attorney establish it. You know how long that could take." Evelyn paused. That answer told her something. For weeks, Preston had spoken as though his access were obvious. Now he was talking about how difficult proving it might be. 2 days later, Daniel returned. He marked the confirmed point where the Ridgeview route entered Evelyn's parcel. Rachel reviewed the proposed location before anything was installed. The barrier would be visible, safe for approaching horses, and entirely positioned according to the surveyed boundary. There would be no traps, no confrontation, and no attempt to interfere with Preston's land. Only a clear end to the permission he had been treating as permanent. The following morning, a fencing contractor pulled into Evelyn's driveway. A new gate lay secured in the back of his truck. For years, Preston's argument had depended on one assumption, that because Evelyn had once said yes, she had somehow lost the right to say no. He was about to find out whether he was willing to prove that assumption somewhere other than her farm. The contractor arrived shortly after 7. Evelyn met him at the western edge of the farm, where Daniel had marked the surveyed boundary 2 days earlier. She had been very specific about what she wanted. Nothing would be dangerous or hidden, and no horse and rider would encounter the gate without warning. The new gate would sit at the entrance to Evelyn's property, clearly visible from the Ridgeview side, with enough room for riders to stop and turn around safely. Beside it, the contractor installed a sign, "Private Farm, No Through Access." Evelyn watched him tighten the final hinge. For the first time in weeks, the trail looked like what it actually was: private land. Preston had received written notice before the installation. Still, at 8:07 the following morning, Evelyn heard horses approaching. She walked toward the gate. The Ridgeview guide appeared first. Behind him stretched a line of riders. He slowed, then stopped. The horses behind him compressed into the trail until riders began asking what was happening. The guide stared at the sign. "Evelyn, morning. Why is there a gate? You'll need to turn around. We're scheduled to use this route. Not across my farm." The guide pulled out his phone. Within minutes, he was calling Preston. The riders waited. One woman looked from the gate to Evelyn. "We were told this was private access for Ridgeview." Evelyn answered carefully. "You should discuss what you were promised with Ridgeview." Preston arrived less than 20 minutes later. He stepped out of his truck and stared at the gate. "You actually closed it?" "Yes. You were told our access claim is being reviewed, and you were told I no longer consent to your development using my property." Preston walked toward the gate but didn't touch it. "This is going to create a serious problem." It already created one. "I have homeowners expecting this route." "Then explain your access rights to them." Preston lowered his voice. "You know exactly what this does to Ridgeview." Evelyn looked past him at the riders. "No, Preston. I know what you did to Ridgeview." His face hardened. "What is that supposed to mean?" "You sold people something before making sure you had the right to provide it." Preston pointed toward the trail behind Evelyn. "That path has been used longer than you've owned this farm, and the historical use is being reviewed. You can't just erase decades because you've suddenly decided you don't like my development. This isn't about liking your development." "Then open the gate until the lawyers finish." "No." It was the first time Evelyn had answered him without explanation. Preston stared at her. Then she added, "If Ridgeview has a legally enforceable right to cross here, your attorney can establish it through the proper process." She touched the gate. "But I'm not going to keep providing access voluntarily while you advertise it as something your development owns." Preston looked toward his guide. "Take them back." The riders began turning their horses. By 9 o'clock, the trail was empty. No hoofbeats passed the barn. No guide appeared around the lower pasture. Evelyn returned to work. But closing the gate didn't end the dispute. It moved it somewhere Preston had much less control over. Back at Ridgeview, residents began asking why their direct trail connection had disappeared. Prospective buyers who had seen the brochures started asking whether the access shown on the map was legally attached to their properties. One homeowner emailed Preston, then another called the sales office. By afternoon, the question had spread through the development. Evelyn didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that for the first morning in weeks, 40 horses hadn't crossed her farm. At 4:30, Rachel called. "Preston's side contacted me." "What do they want?" "They want the gate reopened." "Did they send the easement?" Rachel paused. "No." That single word was about to become a much bigger problem for Preston than the locked gate itself. By noon, Preston's sales office had received 7 calls. By the end of the day, nearly every occupied property at Ridgeview Estates had heard about the gate. Some residents had been part of the riding group that morning. Others had seen horses returning unexpectedly. The question spreading through the development was simple. Did Ridgeview actually own the trail access it had advertised? Preston tried to contain the situation. He told residents there was a temporary disagreement with a neighboring landowner. He said the development's access rights were being reviewed. He assured them he expected the matter to be resolved. But one homeowner, Mark Ellison, asked a more specific question. Where is the trail easement in my closing documents? Preston didn't have an immediate answer. Mark called two other owners. They compared what they remembered from their purchases. All three had seen Ridgeview's marketing materials. All three remembered the direct writing connection being emphasized. One still had the original brochure. Another had saved an email from the sales office describing the community as offering direct access to the surrounding writing network. None of them, however, could immediately identify a recorded property right in their own paperwork that matched what they thought they'd been promised. That didn't automatically mean their contracts had been violated. It didn't prove fraud, and it didn't determine what remedies, if any, a buyer might have. But it created a problem Preston couldn't dismiss with another conversation beside Evelyn's fence. His customers wanted documentation. The following afternoon, Mark drove to Evelyn's farm. He stopped outside the gate rather than entering. Evelyn walked over. "Mrs. Carter?" "Evelyn is fine. I'm from Ridgeview." "I figured." Mark glanced at the sign. "Preston says there's a dispute over access." "There is. Were you paid for us to use this trail?" "No." "Did Ridgeview have an agreement with you?" "Not one I signed." Mark looked uncomfortable. "We were shown this route before we bought." Evelyn nodded. "I've learned that. They rode us through here." That caught her attention. "When?" "Last year during a property tour. That was before many of the homes had even been completed." Evelyn felt her jaw tighten. Preston hadn't simply begun using the trail after residents moved in. He had apparently been demonstrating it while selling the development. "I'm not asking you to open the gate," Mark said. "I just need to understand what happened. Then ask Preston for the document that gives Ridgeview the right to cross my farm. He says historical use supports it. That's his position. And yours." "My family allowed neighbors to cross." "Allowed, yes." Mark looked back toward the ridge. "So you could tell them no?" "We did sometimes during farm work, livestock movement, or bad conditions. People who knew us understood that." Mark was silent for a moment. "That's not how this was presented to us." Evelyn didn't respond. She didn't need to. That evening, Preston called. "You've been talking to my homeowners. One came to my gate. You need to stop discussing Ridgeview's property rights with them. I'm not telling anyone what rights their property has. You're undermining the development." Evelyn's voice remained calm. "No, Preston. I'm telling people what I did and didn't give you." He went silent. Then he said, "This is costing me." Evelyn looked toward the empty trail. For weeks, Preston had treated that as her problem. 40 horses, daily traffic, interrupted farm work, and strangers crossing her property. Now the cost had moved back across the boundary. The next morning, Rachel called with another update. Preston's side had finally provided the documents they believed supported their position. Rachel had reviewed them. There were maps, historical references, and evidence that riders had used the trail. But there was still one thing missing. Nothing they produced showed that Evelyn, or the owners before her, had granted Ridgeview Estates a recorded permanent easement across her farm. Rachel called Evelyn the following afternoon. This time, Preston's attorney had finished reviewing the same material: the survey, title records, old messages, statements from longtime riders, and Thomas Bell's account of how he had used the trail before selling the ridge. "They haven't conceded anything formally," Rachel said. Evelyn wasn't surprised. But their position has changed." "How?" "They're no longer demanding that you reopen the gate while they review their options." Evelyn looked toward Ridgeview. For weeks, Preston had spoken as though access were unquestionable. Now his own attorney was treating it as something that would have to be proven. 2 days later, both sides met near the surveyed boundary. Daniel unfolded his survey across the hood of a truck. He pointed to the line separating Ridgeview from the Carter farm. "Ridgeview ends here." Then he traced the old trail. "And the route crosses the Carter parcel here." Preston's attorney nodded. "We don't dispute the boundary." Rachel looked at him. "So the remaining issue is whether Ridgeview has an independent legal right to cross." "Correct." Preston stepped forward. "People have used that trail for decades." "They have," Rachel said. "But the history of that use matters." She placed copies of the evidence beside the survey. Messages asking permission, thank you notes, accounts from riders who had stayed away when the Carters closed the trail for farm work, and Thomas Bell's statement. The former ridge owner had never claimed a permanent trail right. He had crossed because Evelyn's family allowed him to. Preston looked toward his attorney. What does that mean? His attorney chose his words carefully. It means a claim based on historical use would not be as straightforward as simply proving people rode here for many years. Could we still pursue it? We could evaluate litigation. Would we win? I can't promise that. That answer changed the meeting. Preston finally had to compare two very different choices. He could spend months or longer trying to establish a disputed access right while the gate remained closed and Ridgeview's buyers continued asking questions. Or he could create another route. Neither option was cheap. Only one gave him control over the outcome. Preston pointed toward the green route on an old Ridgeview map. My residents bought expecting this connection. Rachel answered. That's an issue between Ridgeview and whatever representations were made to its buyers. Their expectations don't establish an easement across Evelyn's property. Preston turned to Evelyn. You know what another trail will cost? No. A lot. Then you should have calculated that before advertising mine. You could solve all of this by opening one gate. Evelyn shook her head. You could have solved it before building 14 houses. How? By asking. Silence. Preston's attorney folded his documents. We'll discuss our options. 3 days later, Rachel received his answer. Ridgeview would not seek immediate court intervention to reopen the Carter Trail. Instead, Preston had hired engineers to investigate an alternative connection. That didn't create a sweeping legal judgment. No judge declared Evelyn victorious, and no courtroom magically erased every possible argument Preston could have made. Something more believable had happened. Preston had finally examined the evidence behind the confidence he'd been selling. When forced to choose between fighting over a permission-based history and building access he could actually secure, he chose the route he could control. The line on Daniel's survey had always been there. Preston's mistake wasn't failing to see it. It was building his sales promise as though the line didn't matter. Preston did not open the sales office the next morning. Instead, 2 engineers arrived at Ridgeview Estates. By noon, they were walking the southern edge of the development with survey maps and measuring equipment. Evelyn could see them from her upper pasture. This time, Preston wasn't looking for the easiest route. He was looking for one he could actually use. The alternative ran south from Ridgeview across land controlled by the development before reaching a recorded equestrian access corridor that connected with the larger countryside trail network. That final connection mattered. Preston's engineers verified it before designing anything. The route was longer than the one through Evelyn's farm. It crossed rougher terrain. One section required grading. Another needed drainage work. New fencing would have to be installed along part of it. But unlike the shortcut through Evelyn's property, this route didn't depend on somebody else's informal permission. Preston finally had a path he could build around rights Ridgeview could document. It was exactly the work he should have done before printing the first brochure. 3 days later, Mark stopped near Evelyn's gate. They found another route. I saw the survey crew. Apparently, it connects south of the development. Do they actually have access this time? Mark smiled. That's the first thing everyone asked. Evelyn laughed. And Preston's attorney confirmed the connection before they announced anything. Then maybe we've all learned something. Mark looked down the quiet trail. This one is still shorter. I know. Prettier too. I know that too. Neither fact changed who controlled it. Preston came to the gate later that week. We're building south. Evelyn nodded. I heard. It's going to cost considerably more than using this. He looked past her toward the old trail. What if I pay you instead? It was the first time he'd asked. He had not assumed or threatened this time, he had asked. For an easement? Evelyn said. A formal one. We define the route, hours, maintenance, liability, number of riders, whatever you need. For a moment, Evelyn considered the offer. Not the money. The difference. This was the conversation Preston should have had before 14 houses went on the market. What happens when Ridgeview is sold? She asked. The easement could run with the properties. So it could outlast both of us, yes. And if 40 horses become 60? We negotiate limits now. Evelyn looked toward her barn. That was precisely the problem. She didn't want to negotiate how much commercial traffic her farm would absorb forever. She wanted a working farm. No. Preston stared at her. You haven't even heard the number. I'm not selling the right. Within 2 weeks, construction began. Crews graded the steepest section. Drainage was installed where runoff crossed the proposed trail. Fencing separated riders from neighboring working land. At the southern end, the new route joined the access corridor Preston's team had already verified. Ridgeview revised its maps. The old green line through Evelyn's farm disappeared. The development survived. The 14 houses remained. Residents still had horses, and soon they would again be able to ride directly from Ridgeview into the larger trail network. Preston simply had to pay for the connection he should have secured before promising one. One afternoon, Evelyn heard machinery working beyond the ridge. Her own trail remained silent. Preston had finally found a route for 40 horses. This time, every important line on the map had been checked before anyone was promised the right to cross it. By early fall, the old trail through Evelyn's farm was quiet again. No organized riding groups appeared at 8 in the morning, no guides led prospective buyers past her barn, and no line of 40 horses forced Evelyn to schedule tractors, equipment, or farm work around Ridgeview Estates. The hoofprints gradually disappeared. Grass returned along the edges. The gate remained. So did the sign, "Private Farm, No Through Access." But Evelyn hadn't closed the trail because she hated horses. She hadn't suddenly decided that no one would ever cross her property again. One Saturday morning, Jim Harper rode up alone and stopped outside the gate. "Morning, Evelyn. Morning." Jim looked at the sign. "Guess I should ask now." Evelyn smiled. "You always did." "Mind if I cross?" She looked down the trail. "No equipment moving today." "Go ahead." Evelyn unlocked the gate. Jim rode through, closed it behind himself, and continued toward the lower fields. That small moment captured the distinction Preston had refused to understand. The trail wasn't forbidden. It was hers to permit. Across the ridge, Preston's new route was finally open. It wasn't as direct as the one through Evelyn's farm. Riders had to travel farther south before connecting with the larger countryside network. One section curved around difficult terrain. Another had required grading and drainage work. But it functioned. Ridgeview residents could leave their properties on horseback and reach the riding network without crossing Evelyn's land. Preston revised the maps. The green line that once ran through the Carter farm disappeared. The new route followed land and access the development could actually use. The 14 luxury homes remained. Nobody lost a house, road access, or the ability to own or ride a horse. Preston simply lost the shortcut he'd treated as though it belonged to him. Several weeks later, Evelyn saw him near the boundary. Preston stopped. The new trail opened. "I heard. Residents seem to like it. Good." He glanced toward Evelyn's gate. "Still think this one is better." "It probably is." Preston looked surprised. Evelyn continued. "That's why you wanted it." For once, he laughed. Then his expression became serious. "I should have talked to you before we marketed it." Evelyn nodded. "Yes." There was no speech or dramatic apology, and nothing more was necessary. After Preston left, Evelyn walked the old trail toward her barn. For decades, that strip of dirt had survived because neighbors understood something simple. Permission mattered. A favor could continue for years and still remain a favor. The mistake came when Preston saw that history and assumed he could convert it into something permanent. He had taken occasional neighborly access and transformed it into a selling point. Then 40 horses started crossing every morning. By the time Evelyn objected, Preston had already built the trail into the identity of 14 expensive properties. But his brochures couldn't create an easement. His buyer's expectations couldn't create one either. Evelyn's past generosity wasn't a blank check for somebody else's business. She reached the barn and looked back toward the gate. Jim Harper had closed it behind him exactly as he always had. Preston thought years of neighborly permission had given him a trail he could sell. What he had actually sold was access across a farm whose owner had never given his development the right to cross it. If Evelyn's story reminded you that kindness is not the same as surrendering ownership, share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done after discovering 40 horses crossing your farm as part of a developer's sales presentation? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories about working farms, property rights, hidden documents, and quiet landowners who refuse to be pushed aside. Thank you for watching, and remember, a favor may continue for decades, but it still belongs to the person who has the right to say yes or no.